Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so delighted to introduce this virtual event with TEODROS Kiros and Cornel West presenting their book, Conversations with Cornel West. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, please click on the Q&A button on your screen and we will get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Conversations with Cornel West on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of the series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. We thank you so much for supporting us by showing up and tuning in, both in support of our authors and of the truly fantastic staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings like these, technical issues may arise. We hope they don't, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am honored to introduce our speakers. Dr. Cornel West is a prominent and thought-provoking intellectual and a leading advocate for racial and social justice and equality. His many books and publications include his classic books, Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. He is soon to join Union Theological Seminary and is currently professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and is professor emeritus at Princeton University. He has also taught at Yale and the University of Paris. Dr. TEODROS Kiros is a professor of philosophy and literature at Berklee School of Music, and he has been a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard University for the past 20 years. He is considered a leading authority on moral philosophy and a leading voice in African philosophy. Professor Kiros has been nominated 3 times for Berklee's Distinguished Faculty Award, and he is the producer and host of the internationally acclaimed television program African Ascent. Tonight, they'll be discussing Dr. Kiros's book, Conversations with Cornel West. Professor George Yancey observes of the book, Cornel West defines himself as a bluesman in the life of the mind and a jazzman in the world of ideas. Conversations with Cornel West demonstrates the truth of that self-description as he engages in Socratic dialogue with TEODROS Kiros, a scholar who not only understands the importance of rigor, but who possesses a fund of knowledge that is broad in scope and analytic in precision. I'm so honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Dr. Kiros and Dr. West.
What an honor for that extremely generous introduction. And of course, participating in an event such as this at Harvard Bookstore brings fond memories to my imagination and my moral fiber. My 2 daughters, who are grown-ups now, were schooled, as it were, at the Harvard Bookstore. I used to take them to the kids section, and we used to sit there sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2, with extremely hospitable workers in the background. So this particular event brings me back to participate in a store that I'm extremely fond of. So may I take the honor of thanking the individuals who make this particular event happen, including Nell Pepper, whom we just met with her generous introduction, Serena Logon, Lauren Antilles, Rachel, and Benjamin Quinn, who just invited us to allow the store to display this at C-SPAN, Cornel West's home. There is no place to which Cornel West has not gone. I want to take this opportunity to say a few things from the nerve center of my being without mincing words. Although I have written, I think about 16 books now, this small book with Cornel West is my most favorite. It is a book that is housing a gentle giant, namely Cornel West himself, whom in my judgment, and I do not exaggerate, is the leading public philosopher in the country. His public philosophy is a blend of the pragmatics of John Dewey, the revolutionary Christianity that he himself dug into, out of which he interpreted remarkable theological interventions by way of helping us lost human beings in this forsaken world, which is further blended with a great appreciation and mastery of the philosopher and sociologist W.E. Du Bois. So this public philosophy about which I would like to talk about with Cornel is a blend of three grand traditions in the history of philosophy. And Professor Cornel West is not simply a Black philosopher, he's a philosopher of philosophers. And what I loved about Harvard, in which I happen to be a professor also, which I greatly cherish, is that Harvard used the brilliance of its committee. When Cornel West was in his 20s, he had just written Prophesy Deliverance, which I think is his foundational work, as I say in this little book. And the great Harvard recognized the intellect, the decency, the integrity, and the promise of this young man, and gave him a very early tenure, which came with the highest ranking that the university has to offer. I can't help but appeal to the brilliant president of Harvard University, namely President Berklee, to consider to keep Cornel at Harvard. Cornel loves Harvard. He's a product of Harvard. And I hope Harvard also extends this love to him and keep him. For the sake of the graduate students who adore him, the community that thrills in his free, kind, and always brilliant public lectures at churches, on the streets, in the classrooms, some of which I have attended. I can only appeal to our president to revisit this decision and keep Cornel at Harvard. I understand that, and I'm not surprised that Cornel has already been recruited. There is no university in the world that does not want to have a Cornel West in its faculty. He's a combination of intellect, compassion, decency, and attention to any human being who walks by him. When Cornel makes promises, he delivers them. I say this from the nerve center of my being, at the expense of embarrassing this extremely humble man. Well, Cornel, let's have, if you don't mind, a continuation of the interviews that produced the book, which, as you know, and as you said in your kind way, is a byproduct of the conceptual vision of Kassan Chakoli, the man from New Jersey, who attended to the interviews, became mesmerized by them, gave me a call, and he said, Tedros, there is a book here. It's going to be a small book, but a powerful book, a book for the masses, a book that the masses could carry in trains and buses and read it. Because the book is so accessible, so intelligible. It is a distillation, a summary of what Professor Cornel West has been working on for the past 40 years. I am so proud to have produced, with the help of Africa World Press, this handsome book. So what I thought we should do, Cornel, with your cooperation, is to talk about the nature of public philosophy. What is public philosophy, Cornel, as you see it? What is that about?
Well, first, let me begin by thanking you for those very powerful and poignant words. You've been my brother who's given me tremendous love and support for so many years, so many decades, really. I don't think you realize the ways in which you are an intellectual and a emotional inspiration for me. I'm looking up to you, you being the towering philosopher that you are, and also from East Africa, from Eritrea, that rich tradition that's come to the New World, and the tremendous impact that you've had on people across the nation, and of course, your distinguished position at Berklee School of Music and here at Harvard as well. Of course, we thank Sister Nell Pepper for her leadership. And I just want to say that I agree with you. You know, Harvard Bookstore is a very special place. Some of my most precious intellectual memories have been time spent in those consecrated spaces with those powerful texts, and those texts so thoroughly unsettling and unnerving and unhousing me on so many different levels. And we have to defend and promote our independent bookstores that generate the possibilities of us being able to have access to these smaller places full of such huge and enormous gifts to each and every one of us, though, brother. Now, you already know that I've made my decision, though, brother. I do acknowledge your call to our dear brother Larry Bacow and the others, but Harvard's had its chance the last 4.5 years. You know what I mean? And there's wonderful people at Harvard, but you know, I'm the kind of free Black man, Jesus-loving Black man. I can only put up with so much pettiness and dishonesty and hypocrisy. There's some magnificent people at Harvard. I want that to be known. I want that to be known, and that I will always be a part of the legacy of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who July the 15th, 1838, gave that famous Harvard Divinity School address and was banned from Harvard for 29 years because he was too committed to veritas, too committed to truth, the very motto of Harvard itself. William James, June the 24th, 1903, when he gave his great lecture, The True Harvard, after he received his honorary degree, and he made a fundamental distinction between the visible and the invisible Harvard. He said that visible Harvard was kind of a social club, access to status, usually tied to wealth, forming the power elite or the ruling class. He said, but that invisible Harvard produced the ones who are difficult to discipline, produced the ones who don't fit in, produced the ones who are not well adjusted to what I would say injustice. He didn't use that language, but that's really what he meant. The undisciplinables, he called them. The undisciplinables, the ones that cannot be disciplined because they're tied to a quest for wisdom, not possessing wisdom, a quest for truth, not possessing truth, a quest for beauty, a quest for goodness, not possessing, but in pursuit of it. And you see, that's my Harvard. You see, that's my legacy, and I'll always be very, very blessed to have the Hillary Putnams and Stanley Cavells and the John Rawlses and Robert Nozick's and Roderick First and Martin Kilson. Oh, my dear brother Kilson. Preston Williams, still going, as you know, in his 90s, strong as ever. You know, these are teachers that poured themselves, their hearts and minds and souls into me and shaped me, cracked vessel that I am. They shaped me to be someone who has a vocation, not just a profession, who has a calling, not just a career. So in the face of commodification, in the face of big money, in the face of obsession with reputation, in the face of viewing students too much as consumers rather than citizens in the making, human beings who must attempt to learn how to die in order to learn how to live by critically examining their assumptions. And when they give some of those assumptions up, that's a form of death, to be reborn over and over again in what the Greeks call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, that grand, deep education, not that cheap schooling that goes with just gaining access to a skill and a slot in order to make big money off to the races with careerism and opportunism headed toward wealth. No, Harvard at its best has always been tied to what Du Bois represented, an exemplar of a calling, an exemplar of a vocation. And that's my tradition. That is my tradition. And that public philosophy. William James was the most adorable and profound public philosopher the United States has ever had. He had no AB, he had no BA, he had no PhD. He only had an MD. But he went his own way because he knew philosophy was not an abstract academic discourse, it was a way of life. It was a mode of being in the world with all of its existential gravitas, dealing with the concrete, the specific, the singular, and most importantly, dealing with death, dread, despair, disappointment, domination, dogma, all of those inescapable and unavoidable features of we creatures in space and time. And he begins where I begin and where we begin in this magnificent text, because you're so right, my brother. This book is the best crystallization and articulation of what my worldview, what my Weltanschauung actually is. And I didn't know I can do it. I don't know how you pulled it off, because we sat down in those 2 days for African Ascent, your magnificent journal, and said, let's just talk. And next thing I know, you pulling out of me all of these different pillars of my way of looking at the world. But I begin with line 607 B5 of book 10 of Plato's Republic, that originary text of the Western philosophical tradition, the traditional quarrel between poetry and philosophy, and his attempt to displace Homer as the source of paideia, his attempt to displace poetry as the source of education, with his new discourse called philosophia, philosophy, tied much more to number, tied much more to logic, fearful of poetry, banning most of the poets from the polis. The only poets he allows are those who was singing encomiums to great men and hymns to gods. Those are the only poets allowed. Why is he so fearful of poetry? What a compliment to poetry. Because it's so powerful. Because it's so shaking, this effect of shaking, creating intellectual vertigo in creatures and make them think so they don't fit into the hierarchy so well. And Plato himself, of course, is such a profound figure because he's actually a poet who's fearful of poetry. He's a philosopher who's in love with philosophy, and he's caught betwixt and between. Now, I come from a tradition of Black people, which means that for me, I choose to philosophize in such a way that it goes to school, not just with poetry and history and story and narrative, but with music. You see, with sonic expression. And, Plato bans the flute in the Republic because the flute, like poetry, appeals to those non-rational, trans-rational, quote unquote, irrational aspects of the human soul. And he wants that hierarchy in place with the rational and the spirited and the appetitive, that threefold ranking that sets in place the very conception of philosophy, politics, education in so much of the modern West. And so for me, I'm very glad to be deeply conversant with the best of the West, but I'm not solely of the West. Now, of course, I am of the West family, Clifton and Irene. That's the highest honor I ever had, being the second son of Clifton and Irene. But I'm talking about the West as a civilization over time and space, because I come from the underside of the West. You see, I come from a hated people who still attempt to dish out love warriors. I come from a traumatized people who still try to dish out wounded healers rather than wounded herders. I come from a terrorized people, still dishing out freedom fighters, not terrorizing back, but calling for freedom for everybody, every color, every gender, every sexual orientation, every nation. You see, so that the legacy of Athens and the legacy of Jerusalem, the Socratic and the prophetic are so intertwined, but is dipped in the blues, is dipped in the doings and sufferings of a Black people, a great people, a world historical people who has made contributions to conceptions of what it means to be human that have disproportionately shaped the cultures of the world, not because of skin pigmentation, but because of genius and talent and creativity and courage and fortitude and vision and discipline. Generation after generation after generation. And also because in the States, we're part of an empire that has a disproportionate amount of power, including cultural visibility in the world. So the cultural products of a Black people in the American empire is known all around the world, the blues and jazz and rhythm and blues and hip hop, lingua franca of younger generation all around the world, owing to being a beneficiary of US soft power, US cultural power, US symbolic capital, and its hard power, its military, its geopolitical interests, shaping the world in its own image, are attempting to do so, especially from 1945 up until the present. But of course, we know the empire is in deep trouble these days, in deep decay, when we'll get to that. But that's the beginning, my brother, of what this text with you is all about. And I can't do anything but just continually salute you, of you being able to take the time and having the patience to sit down with me and put this together. And our dear brother in Trenton, ooh, Brother Castle, oh Lord, nobody liked him. Now, of course, he published my second book way back in 1988, Prophetic Fragments, and he was just beginning then. And now he has become this towering figure with a towering institution, African World Press. And we're going to have book parties in Lagos, in Dakar, in Johannesburg, in London, in LA, in DC. But we begin in Cambridge, Massachusetts via Zoom, wrestling with death, dread, despair, disappointment, domination, dogma, and the creative responses to all of those realities, so that they never in the end have the last word. We're committed to love of truth, beauty, goodness, and as a Christian, as you say, in my own case, a love of God.
That's right. That's right. Now, Cornel, what I'm puzzled about, Cornel, is this. You were appointed at the Divinity School, among other things, as a professor of the practice of public philosophy. Public philosophy analytically entails the self-imposed task of addressing the manifestations of the sufferings and miseries that the human condition is replete with. And in your case, of course, I have observed you, I have listened to you. It could be Israel, it could be Palestine, it could be South Africa, it could be Ethiopia, it could be Eritrea. What is remarkable about you is your ability to combine judiciousness, analytic acuity, fairness, and of course, courage and truth speaking, the two fundamental principles of a genuine discourse that we learned from the ancients in Athens. Namely, that we cannot engage in the world if our discourse, by definition, is motivated by the search for truth and the willingness to say it courageously, fiercely, even at the expense of destroying yourself, if you must, on the behalf of human beings. It is this category of public philosophy that impressed me deeply at the Divinity School, under the rubrics of which you were hired. And because of which I said to myself, Professor Cornel West has no choice but to take on the miseries of the world and address them. And sometimes address them in a way that is painful to some, fulfilling to others, confusing to yet others, sufficiently unclear to many, sometimes deliberately ambiguous. The possibilities are numerous, but that public philosophy, by its very nature, brings you to the public arena to speak truthfully and courageously. And there is a price to be paid for that. And that is the price that you have been paying for so long. You are my mentor, my friend. I look up to you. And many are looking up to you. That's why this recent incident, I truly think, is based on a misunderstanding. There is a misunderstanding somewhere that has taken place between the committee that looked at the desiderata and the brilliant members of the committee who by definition know what public philosophy is. And in that, by definition, at the expense of repeating myself, it necessarily entails concerns with the human condition, which cannot be said in a lukewarm manner. If they are, they will lose the potency, the relevance, the greatness, the purpose, the mission. The lexicon is quite long. That is my understanding of the public philosophy of James, of John Dewey, whom you rightly adore, the great Du Bois. All his works are guided by the love of human beings. This is what you've chosen as a life vocation. And in that, it doesn't matter where you go. This concern is going to follow you because you have chosen a vocation which by definition is public.
Oh, that's absolutely right, my brother. That's absolutely right. And we go back, though, if we go back to Athens, let's go back to Socrates and his concern about the shaping of the soul, the shaping of the character, the kinds of virtues and values and visions that ought to inform how we decide to live a certain kind of life in space and time from our mama's womb to tomb. And the ways in which Socrates goes into the public square, he goes into the agora, he interacts, be it a slave in the Meno, it could be poets, it could be politicians. And he says, what? I know that I know more than others precisely because I know nothing at all. Precisely. Even though he does later on claim he knows something about love, about Eros that he learned from Diotima, that he learned from Aspasia, that he learned from a woman. He was the mentoree to that woman philosopher, and ends up, living with Pericles, never really marries, but so that the issues of gender here are very important as well. But with Socrates, and I take Socrates very seriously, he's one of the great sources of inspiration for my vocation, that he is the one calling for the unexamined life is not worth living. He is the one saying that the cause of my unpopularity is parrhesia, line 24a of Plato's Apology. What is parrhesia? Fearless speech, plain speech, frank speech, unintimidated speech. It's not spineless. Socrates had a backbone, and he was willing to pay a cost He was on the road to the hemlock after the condemnation of him by his fellow citizens, right? So I take that very seriously. The courage to think for himself. It's precisely what Emerson said. There's nothing more sacred than the integrity of your mind. I think that's a strong claim. I think it's highly sacred. I think there are a few things more sacred than just integrity of your mind. But Emerson has that Socratic legacy. It's mediated by Montaigne. He passed it on to Henry David Thoreau. He passed it on to William James and John Dewey, all the way up to you and I, even as we come from the chocolate side of town, the chocolate side of the world. We have a relationship to that rich Socratic legacy. So, but Socrates never sheds a tear. He never cries. And this is where the great prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, the genius of Hebrew scripture. It begins with tears, with cries, with moans, with groans, with sighs of an oppressed people, an enslaved people, who then make a covenant with the highest power in the cosmos, with God. And the call, the summons is to spread hesed, that steadfast love, that loving kindness to the orphan and widow, to the fatherless, the motherless, the persecuted, the subjugated, the dominated, the stranger, 400 times, the neighbor, love thy neighbor as thyself. That's Leviticus 19th chapter. And that Palestinian Jew named Jesus that I fell in love with on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California, in Shiloh Baptist Church, with Reverend Willie P. Cook telling us every Sunday, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. I can't conceive of myself without my relation to a crying people, a Jesus who weeps for Jerusalem. He weeps for Lazarus. He makes his way to the temple to run out the money changers with 500 Roman troops on the one side, the bankers on the inside, the intellectuals rationalizing the exploitation of the poor right alongside. I follow Jesus into that temple. That's why I end up critical of the White House, critical of the Pentagon, critical of Hollywood, critical of Harvard, critical of Silicon Valley, any set of elites who have tremendous amounts of power and wealth, but are indifferent and callous to the suffering of poor people and working people. So the fusion of the Socratic legacy of Athens, critical examination, mustering the courage to think critically for yourself, but no tears. Something's wrong. That's a keep sweat moment. Something just ain't right. Nobody who's ever loved somebody or anybody who's loved somebody shed some tears, like you shed tears at your mama's funeral. What you gonna do, Socrates, at your mama's funeral, at Xanthippus' heartbreak, when your three sons disappoint you? Now, my dear brother Kerry Corrigan, my dear brother Emory, he argues that Socrates actually may have shed some tears, just like Xenophon has Socrates dancing. Not in Plato's dialogues. But you don't have to worry about that when you get to Jerusalem, the legacy of Jerusalem. You see, you're going to have some dancing. You're going to have some wrestling with nothingness in Ecclesiastes. You're going to be dealing with an absent God in moments in Psalms. You're going to be dealing with a lion's den with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You're going to be dealing with unbelievable wrestling with despair in Gethsemane. Echoes of the 32nd chapter of Genesis, where Jacob is wrestling with the angel of death in the midnight hour and emerges with a new name called Israel, God wrestler, but with wounds, deep wounds and scars and bruises. Now, when you get to the blues, when you get to the tragic comic conceptions of being in the world connected to Socratic self-examination, but no tears. Jesus weeping, loving, emptying himself, donating himself, serving others, but Jesus never laughing. Socrates never cries, Jesus never laughs. Here comes the blues, full of wit and laughter. Sometimes laughing in order to keep from crying, but laughing nevertheless. That's the Black connection to Shakespeare's Falstaff, the grand exemplar of the comic, the lust of life, the fun, the joy, the pleasure, the gaiety, and yet at the same time, running up against the wall with his good friend Hal, who disappoints him. We won't go into the story, but what we're talking about here are the contours of a larger worldview that is philosophic in terms of its love of wisdom, grounded in history, especially the underside of history of oppressed peoples, very much like Hebrew scripture, but tied to an intellectual integrity. Socrates, that's why we go to sleep with Nietzsche. We disagree with his understanding of Judaism and Christianity and Islam and liberalism and socialism, the things that he hated, because he saw that as a leveling. He saw that as ordinary people gaining some kind of power against the very strong and convincing them that, lo and behold, they ought to be identified with the vulnerable. That's what he hated. That's what I love. Nietzsche and I have a profound clash, but he had an intellectual integrity. He had an intellectual conscience. And of course, in many ways, he had elements of the very thing he rejected. He was influenced by the very thing that he called into question. That's why he ends his life defending that mule before the insanity sets in, because of the deep love and passion, compassion that he really did have, as it were. But that dew of love never really fell on the rainless, parched land of his solitude. That wonderful line in Thomas Mann's great essay on Nietzsche. Well, see, for Black folk, at our best, love warriors, freedom fighters, wounded healers, from Aretha Franklin to Martin Luther King Jr., from James Baldwin to Toni Morrison, from W.B. Du Bois to Donny Hathaway, from the dramatics and the Delphonics to the intellectual teams that constituted the legal minds to push through the breaking the back of American apartheid, led by Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, spilling over with the best of Harvard law. Harvard still playing a role at its best, but every institution has the best and its worst, just like the best and the worst is inside of each and every one of us. So to engage in public philosophy is to be intellectually prepared, to armor yourself so that evil never surprises you and despair never paralyzes you. But you're wrestling with despair every day as a human being, and especially as a Black man or a Black woman, or an indigenous man or woman, or a Latino man or woman, or an Arab man or woman, or a Palestinian man or woman. And for so long, a Jewish man or woman, vicious forms of anti-Jewish hatred and prejudice in the history of the United States, it's been pushed back. Thank God, it's been pushed back. But the question becomes, what happens when those who have been victimized gain access to powerful positions? Will they then engage in their own forms of rendering others invisible? Not just in the United States, but when you get the precious Jewish brothers and sisters being viciously attacked by an evil thug called Hitler, trying to push them into concentration camp, push them into the most unimaginable conditions, jumping out of the burning buildings of Europe and then landing in a land in which there's Arabs and Jews. You're going to decide, do you coexist as Einstein wanted to do, and Judah Magnus wanted to do, and Aham wanted to do, or will you dominate the way Jabotinsky wanted to do? fundamental question. And so when people ask me the question, why are you always talking about the Palestinians? I'm concerned with every oppressed group. Dalits, I'm concerned with Ethiopian peasants, Eritrean peasants. I'm concerned with peasants in Brazil. I'm concerned with the Roma. I'm concerned with the Muslims in China. I'm concerned with Jamal and Letitia in Roxbury. I'm concerned with indigenous brothers and sisters. I'm concerned with poor whites in Appalachia. It's a moral and spiritual lens through which one views the world, but it means you have to be consistent. And to be consistent today is very difficult when we talk about the Palestinian brothers and sisters, because it's hard to have a robust, uninhibited dialogue about their suffering. Because you and I know if there was a Palestinian occupation of precious Jewish brothers and sisters, there would be massive solidarity with Jews. Massive, and rightly so. I'd have exactly the same righteous indignation against any domination of Jews. But when there's an Israeli occupation of somebody else, all of a sudden it's hard because the charge of anti-Semitism comes at you so quick. And the charge is an important one. No, we should never fall in any anti-Jewish traps, but we shouldn't allow the anti-Semitic charge to dampen our fire for the solidarity with any peoples that elites of whatever ethnicity are promoting. And we have this struggle, of course, in Africa, right? You got Ugandan thugs, you got Ethiopian thugs, you got Nigerian thugs, you got South African thugs and gangsters don't want to be accountable, treat their people anyway, and then use their skin color as if they've got some symbolic solidarity. No, we've got a moral and a spiritual challenge here. And so it becomes one of being willing to, as you say, rightly pay a price. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And Harvard has a history of this. My dear brother, Paul Sweezy, one of the finest economists of his generation, he got pushed out of Harvard. He found it in Monthly Review. Thank God he got the money from the great F.O. Matheson, who was one of the greatest American literary critics, wrote that classic American Renaissance. In 1941 was the master of Eliot House. When his father died, he gave Paul Sweezy the money for Monthly Review. It is still going. But one of the reasons why it's still going, because Harvard pushed out Paul Sweezy. Joseph Schumpeter and the others tried to fight for him. Kenneth Galbraith tried to fight for him. No. And we can go on, and there's a whole history of this. Bonnie Honig, it's the whole history of this. So I don't really get discouraged. I'm just concerned that the doors remain open for the younger generation. This is not about me. I'm going to land somewhere, like you say, and all of the self-confidence and the self-trust that I have. It doesn't really bother me in that way, but it certainly concerns me and deeply disturbs me in terms of what kind of sign and signal it sends to young people trying to find their footing, get their calling and their vocation in place. They say, you treat this Black man in this way, how you gonna treat me? And that's the last thing we need, is dampen intellectual, moral, and spiritual fire at a moment of such spiritual decay and moral decrepitude in the empire, in the country. And so we've got to just, again, this is a Sankofa moment. You got to be connected to the best of your past. You got to realize that the highest levels of arate, the highest levels of excellence, manifest in a tradition that you identify with. William James said, always have a habitual vision of excellence, an habitual vision of greatness, not success, not commodified success, not just money status, not just being patted on the back by the establishment, but well adjusted to injustice and fitting in too well to an unjust status quo. No, that's not my tradition at all. That's not my tradition at all. That's what it is for me to engage in my own fallible way and my own finite and fallen way in public space, building on those Socratic and prophetic legacies of the West and building on the blues. You got to enter that public space singing your song on intimate terms with catastrophe, knowing that you seem as is Pharaoh is on both sides of the bloody Red Sea. That's what Henry Highland Garnett used to say in the 1830s for Black people. How you gonna deal with a situation in which everywhere you look, it seems as if there's a Pharaoh? Sometimes the Pharaoh's Black, sometimes they white, sometimes they're different colors, sometimes they're different gender.
Absolutely.
You see what I mean?
Absolutely.
And yet somehow you got to be able to keep on pushing, as the great genius from Chicago, Curtis Mayfield, put it. Tied to that love supreme that John Coltrane exemplified, playing that European instrument in such a way that one would have never known that it was created by Adolphe Sax in Belgium when that Black man got done playing.
And now, Cornel, we must, with your help, pay homage to our two brothers, George Yancey and Neil Robert.
Yes. Oh, isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth?
Extraordinary pieces.
I think you brought that out of them. You brought that out of them.
Extraordinary.
Just amazing.
I have read many forewords and introductions. I do not exaggerate, but none like this two. They poured out everything they know about excellent writing and excellent thinking and brought the book forward. And I would appreciate your comments on them and your recognitions of their works.
Yeah, my dear brother George Yancey, he writes on the cruciform of love in the crucible of catastrophe. And he's actually building on some of my basic themes and motifs.
Yes.
What it means to have a catastrophic consciousness. You know, Ellison used to say the blues ain't nothing but a personal narrative of catastrophe lyrically expressed. Nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's the blues. Strange Fruit. Billie Holiday sang about it, a genius, written by the Jewish brother Maripol. That's catastrophe. That's not a Negro problem. That's a catastrophe visited on Black people by white supremacist institutions and fellow citizens, individuals. But what is it about Billy? What is it about BB? They got so much style, with a smile, with the history and the best of their tradition at their back, that they don't allow that catastrophe to have the last word. So it's a spirit of tenacity, inseparable from a spirit of humility. And that is something that is, it's a leaven within that larger loaf of the Socratic legacy of Athens and prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, because it's got the comic in it. The only artist I know deeper than the blues is Chekhov. And that's only because he's not American. He doesn't believe in the green light ever, the way Scott Fitzgerald ends that great American novel. Gatsby believed in the green light. Tomorrow things would be better. Tomorrow things would be grander. Tomorrow, deeply American. It's a romantic impulse. Chekhov has none of that. So he's got the blues without that impulse. Chekhov, how you gonna make it? Yeah, he's on the love train. He's Darwinian, he's secular, he's a medical doctor. He's the greatest of them all in terms of a love conductor. But there's no backdrop of a green light whatsoever, you see, in the ravine of the student, all the great stories that we know with Chekhov. Now, why is that important? Well, because we live in the age of Chekhov. We live in the age of the blues. We've got ecological catastrophe. We got nuclear possible catastrophe. We got economic catastrophe. We got political catastrophe. We got psychic catastrophe, spiritual catastrophe, escalating depression, escalating wealth inequality, escalating political dysfunctionality with elites who oftentimes are tied either to big money or concerned only about reproducing themselves, locked into an impasse with very low quality, low intellectual vision and talent. Mediocrity becomes the mark of the political class and more the professional class. Why? Because of greed. Greed on steroids. Give me more money. Give me more status. Give me more image. Give me more spectacle. Give me more visibility. Don't you have enough? Oh, it's addictive, isn't it? You never have enough. It's like having insatiable pleasures, but no joy. All the pleasures in the world, but your heart is still empty and vacuous. And the younger generation comes along and says, we're hungry for the real thing. We've seen the superficial stuff. We see all the money and the status and the trophy spouses and the self-projections of persons who think so highly of themselves. We're tired of the peacocks. Peacocks strut because they can't fly. We want some eagles who look low with nobility, but a biblical criteria of nobility. He or she is greatest among you will be your servant, will love truth, will love veritas, will love beauty in the face of the superficial. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, yeah, you view life, you view your whole culture as a gold rush obsessed with superficial, sparkling things, you're going to end up worshiping a golden calf. Oh, we've got stories about that in Hebrew scripture, don't we? Even Aaron was a part of it. But they can be awakened. The sleepwalking does not have to be perennial and eternal. They can come to terms with something deeper than that. That's the best of America. It's the best of Harvard. That's why Thoreau went to Walden Pond to do what? Try to awaken my fellow citizens because they were sleepwalking. It was on their backs as they slept that slavery was in place, that the new wage labor that was exploiting the so-called free labor of white folk in the North was in place. And folk were losing their sense of individuality as they were obsessed with conformity and complacency and complicity. And worse than anything else, cowardliness. See, I come from a people that at our best, we said we would rather be dead than afraid. That's what Martin Luther King said. We'd rather be corpses than a coward and sell our souls for a mess of pottage. That's a great tradition. It sets a high standard. Nobody we know fully approximates the standard, but we know what the standard is. You see, we know what the standard is, you see. And so when Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and others come close to it, we say, oh, we take notice. Martin King wasn't the richest. He wasn't even the most clever. He wasn't even the smartest. He was the most loving. He was the most courageous. He wasn't the smartest. The cult of smart, Frederick DeBauer says. The tyranny of merit, our dear brother Michael Sandel has laid out with such power. Yes, shatter those idols and try to stay in contact with the humanity of your less well-off fellow citizens. Only 67% of Americans even go to college. Here's Harvard at the top. So what do you do in that kind of democratic experiment as it undergoes decay and deterioration? How do you attempt to attend to the complexity and the ambiguity of the human beings who also populate the same national territory that you do? That's what our students need, but it's hard to attend to our students in a commodified neoliberal university where the obsession is more and more the big money at the top with the bureaucrats, the big donors coming through, and the obsession with trying to keep a reputation when the real challenge is what James called a true heart. What kind of vocations are you generating? You see, what kind of character in your students are you generating? And with there's wonderful people on the faculty, staff, and students, but the dominant thrust going the wrong way. And that's part of the neo-fascism in the country, my brother. The contempt for neoliberal elites of whatever color, because they see arrogance, they see haughtiness, they see condescension. When you're looking down and thinking so highly of yourself, that's already a sign of your spiritual immaturity and your insecurity about who you are. See, Trump is just a symbol and a sign and a symptom of it. It's an extreme case, neo-fascist that he is. But all of that insecurity, all that immaturity, all that inability to love, all that inability to generate any form of intimacy and vulnerability, that inability to love, like Hamlet, that becomes massive in the culture. That's the sign of an end of an empire. That's the sign of American Gibbon getting ready to put pen to paper to write a classic, The Decline and Fall of the American Empire. To probably be a Black woman who writes, because of the vantage points of keeping track of the obsessions with masculine power, and white power, and class power, and imperial power, you see. But we never know. I mean, art is a complicated thing. Thomas Pynchon is still writing classics, as old as he is, and he's got the same or similar sensibility that I do, and he's my vanilla brother.
Well, we could go on and on for the next 2-3 hours. Our great viewers, what you heard is only the tip of the iceberg. Cornel is also a thrilling writer. He writes plainly, clearly, and powerfully, and Conversations with Cornel West is a literary feast. Of course, if I had time, I would have liked to read an excerpt or two from the book, but I would rather have you be surprised by buying it and then reading it for the first time, so that I wouldn't spoil the party for you. So what I thought is democratic in the spirit of what Cornel stands for is to engage the public, to interact with Cornel by asking questions, and both of us addressing them, with I participating if it needs be. But the focus tonight is on Cornel. The title of the book is Conversations with Cornel West. So dear members out there, 113 of you, we're extremely grateful. We are more than willing to entertain questions. Rene Pepper would, I think, lead that part of the event.
Sister Nell.
There you are, Nell. I was looking for you.
Happy to. So let me see. So we're I think folks were kept so wrapped by your conversation that I think we're only starting to get some questions coming in now. So I'll be kind of reading and speaking at the same time. So the first question that came in from Abdullahi Keita. So this is an interesting question. So they ask, how can African American know-how be leveraged to help develop Africa, which might in turn uplift Blacks everywhere? I wonder if that's, it was the first question that came in. I'm checking in. I don't know if that's a question that you'd like to turn around at all or discuss at all, both of you.
My dear brother can jump in on that. He's a bridge builder and a bridge himself, given his intellectual stature and moral sensitivity.
Well, I think one of the few things that I have attempted to do as part and parcel of my philosophical project is to have introduced to the philosophical world, for example, the works of an Ethiopian philosopher who lived in the 19th century by the name of Zerai Yaakov, whom I present in the book not only as one of the founders of the Enlightenment, because chronologically, as a matter of fact, Zora Jacob lived around the same time that Descartes did, but his treatise actually was published before Descartes. So chronologically speaking, in fact, we could argue that Zora Jacob is one of the founders of the Enlightenment. And I don't like the term founder of an African Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is a universal project. It does not have to be ground in race, ethnicity, gender, and sex. It is simply a particular kind of relationship with reason. In the case of the Jacob, he thought that what we call reason is housed, he argues, in the soul. And what is even more, that the heart itself, he contends, is the organ through which we think. And in that, contrary to the dominant scientific misunderstanding of the human heart, to have been reduced only to its physical functions, namely this tireless pumping of blood, Zora Jacob contends, following, I think, a powerful tradition in ancient Egypt, which Aristotle and Plato made their own. In fact, the heart is a transcendental organ, by which they mean what we call thinking, in fact, originates in the human heart in the form of impulses, thought impulses, which are then neurologically shared with the brain. And the brain collects the data that originates elsewhere outside of it, in this instance in the human heart, and then the brain's function is to process thoughts that it did not originate, but thoughts that originated elsewhere that it processes. This, for example, this understanding, this argument, I think, dignifies the African presence in the world, that Africa is not merely a place on which you deposit neoliberal, liberal, and other kinds of projects, but that Africa becomes, in fact, a source in a very responsible way of an alternative relationship with nature, with thought, with human obligations, at the source of compassion, integrity, truth, so forth and so on, which the ancient Egyptians, as Cornel knows, embodied in Ma'at, this female goddess whom they thought was an embodiment of these practices, and in that the pharaohs in ancient Egypt who were worthy of preserving the hearts of were the pharaohs who had lived guided by the motivating forces of compassion, integrity, truth-speaking, and wisdom. In this sense, then, I argue in this book that Africa itself could give an image of possibilities for its brothers and sisters here, who are being put in deplorable conditions. But as Cornel says, in spite of these deplorable conditions, look at the musics that African Americans, descendants of Africa, produced and gave the world. Cornel always says, and quite rightly, that the African-American presence in the Americas, as a matter of fact, is not merely an imitation, a replication of an African root, but using that African root to create something original, something remarkable in the heat of suffering. That's one argument. Another argument that I deployed in my first book when I was 32 years old. Cornel wrote his in 29, when he was 29 years old. And I wrote a book called Moral Philosophy and Development, the Human Condition in Africa, in which, very much like Cornel, I learned from the great luminary at Harvard, namely John Rawls. And I took his 2 principles of justice and then revised them, and I lexically reordered the relationship between the first principle and the second principle, because I'm an African. For me, the first principle would necessarily have to be attending to the imperative of providing food, shelter, clothing, and health to those who do not have it, before we move to the second principle of justice. Rawls, on the other hand, of course, as everybody knows, gave primacy to the liberties, to the first principle, and then the second principle. The second principle logically follows. I reordered this. I shared the book with John Rawls when he was alive. We discussed it. I gave him the book. He liked it. He did not exactly endorse it because I have distorted the relationships between the two principles of justice. But he did not say, do not publish it. But he did not review it either. So I struck on my own. And that book now is being revisited, and some people think it's a seminal contribution from Africa to the world, in which I propose that these two principles of justice should be constitutionally mandated, and in that what Cornel calls the African elites who take advantage of the principle of liberties should be regulated and controlled by the obligation that they have constitutionally to make sure that food, shelter, and clothing is given to human beings before we can allow the elites to buy the cars, the homes, the mansions, so forth and so on. We cannot lexically move from the second principle to the first principle, but rather we move from the first principle to the second principle after we satisfy the necessary conditions of seeing to it that human beings are provided with food, shelter, clothing, and other material. Then it makes sense to allow the possibility of some human beings to have a little more than what the first principle allows. This too is a contribution that originates in African philosophical discourse that I think could be of use because with suitable modifications and through something like what Paget Henry calls a Marshall Plan, for example, could be used to eliminate and dismantle ghettos from the US. Once we dismantle these ghettos, then we can begin to see the creativities of the Black masses, what they could do. But
the abolition of
yes.
poverty, the abolition of decrepit housing, the abolition of inadequate health care, not having access to. But I want to say a quick word about great John Rawls, because he was my dear brother. He was my teacher. He was the chairman of the philosophy department when I was there. That what Brother TEODROS is saying is so important in terms of Rawls being committed to intellectual freedom and robust conversation across the board. That he was the mentor of a great African philosopher named Menkiti.
That's right.
And when you got Menkiti and yourself, the two towering figures to emerge from the continent through the Harvard-Boston connection. He just died. I spoke at his funeral just a few months ago. He was my teacher as well. But Rawls, I mean, here's this vanilla brother from Baltimore, from the same city as our dear brother Brandon Terry, who was just a magnificent political theorist and already making his mark. But you get this vanilla brother from Baltimore, Princeton undergrad, who embraces African voices, yes, embraces my chocolate voice from California, tied to his particular form of liberalism. Complicated, rich, Brother Tommy Shelby, working in his own refined way, Tim Scanlon, another vanilla brother, always open to a variety of different voices. You see, these are figures that we have to lift up as exemplars of a commitment to discourses in which there are no taboos. Just taking a very serious embrace of the best of John Stuart Mill's classic of 1859 on liberty. And so that when people could begin to see elective affinities, what our dear brother said about Yakub, you could think, oh, well, Pascal says the heart has its reasons that reason knows not of. Interesting. Well, Leopardi, the great Italian lyrical poet, says the mind's sweet shipwreck. Yeah. Right when reason hits up against the wall, like the Titanic hits the iceberg, that Thomas Hardy's poem projects with such power. What happens when you have that cacophony of voices? The conversation of humankind that Michael Oakeshott talked about and Richard Rorty appropriated. You see, that's the best of Harvard, that's the best of the academy in the midst of overwhelming suffering, in the midst of overwhelming misery. and trying to shatter the parochialism, shatter the provincialism, and shatter the mendacities, the lies that has too often been told about women, poor people, Black people, indigenous people, gay brothers, lesbian sisters, non-binary, Jews, Arabs, Palestinians, Eskimos. You say, oh my God, that sounds like PC chit chat. No, we talking about human history and all of its complexity. And it's a slow process. But if you give up on that process and you fall into your own dogmatism that reinforces your domination, that doesn't allow you to see what kinds of forms of death you are promoting, you're going to lose your planet, you're going to lose your democracy, and most importantly, because I'm on the love train, you're going to lose your capacity to love. And that's what Dostoevsky says. Hell is what in Brother Karamazov? Hell is those who suffer from the incapacity to love. That's a serious thing.
Brother Cornel, I have to be grateful to you for mentioning the great Menkiti, who incidentally—
Oh, yes. Yeah, he's my brother. Oh, I love that brother.
I loved him. We're extremely close. He reviewed Moral Philosophy and Development and called it seminal.
I didn't realize that though, brother.
Yes, he reviewed. He was
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. Yeah. He ran he and his beloved wife on the Grolier
the poetry
bookstore right around the corner from from Harvard bookstore. I mean, those are two pillars of civilization that is in its best form when you think about it.
It was Menkiti and Waradu, who was also my mentor, companion to African philosophy, has 3 entries that were given to me, one on Fanon, one on Zara Yacob, on this seminal work. I was given the 3 spaces by Waradu. And Menkiti's classical piece on the concept, the moral concept, and the
he had one on collective responsibility.
Exactly. That's right.
Oh, that's a classic piece.
Incredible man. He was a giant.
Now, he represents the best of the human spirit. But so does Ross. So does Hillary Putnam. So does Stanley Cavell. I mean, these are people who are love warriors at the highest level that took their intellectual vocation so seriously.
Loved you was the great Nigerian Francophone, the dean of Francophone literature, the great Abiola Irele.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely.
There's another master.
Absolutely. But you think of how blessed we are. We've got to be 2 of the most blessed Black men in late modernity.
I think so.
All of the love and support.
I look up to you always.
I look up to you, Lord. I know we're going on and on, but we should have some more questions here. Sorry. We have a good time. We have a good time. We get together.
I think we probably we have time, I think, for one more question. I'm sorry for we've had so many questions come in, but I think we could end it on this one. So this is from Hailu Abreha, and he is in Roxbury. So he asks, as an Ethiopian American young Black man in America from Roxbury, I come to great conflicts with my perspective of academia in America, which seems to benefit whites disproportionately. What are some of your ways in navigating this journey in a quest for wisdom for the young Black man, or for the young Black man in a time where the effects of redlining are still very present? I guess just in general, I mean, I suppose I have that question too. I mean, how does one navigate that?
I think I'll let Cornel handle this. Cornel is a master of this.
Well, no, I mean, I would just say that you want to be committed to your own integrity and honesty and decency and to your own freedom, so that don't allow any institution to confine what you read, what you're exposed to. You hunt it down for yourself. Hunt down persons who are interested in it. So if you're not getting it in the classroom, you can get it with them, stealing away after the pandemic, a coffee shop or something. So that you always want to be improvisational and flexible and fluid enough to be able to pursue that which you think is crucial in terms of cultivating your gifts so you can be the best force for good that you are. That's what the Negro National Anthem is. Lift every voice. It doesn't say lift every echo. You're not an extension of an echo chamber. You get enough of that in corporate media. You get enough of that in the polarized society. Find out ways in which you can be your best self in process, always growing, maturing, but also willing to pay a cost. Because we got all this obsession with comfort and convenience. That's the worst thing you can have. The great Alfred North Whitehead said there's ought to be a noble, critical discontent set in. So if the Ethiopian brother feels as if, well, these schools seem to be too Eurocentric, read the best of that and then read on your own or sit in on other classes. That's what I was able to do at Harvard and Yale and Princeton. I sat in on a variety of different departments. If it wasn't in the philosophy department, I went to Comp Lit. Wasn't in Comp Lit, I can go to history. If I can go to history, it's in German. Well, they're not teaching Nietzsche in Emerson Hall. That's all right. They were teaching Nietzsche in the German department. You see, when Nietzsche says Pascal is greater than Spinoza and Spinoza is the greatest of them all, but what is it about Pascal? Nietzsche, you like Christians like that? Well, things are complicated. Oh, you're in love with Montaigne too, aren't you, Nietzsche? You said you have joy that he even existed. 98 references, not one critical reference to Montaigne. Nietzsche, God is dead. Interesting. Things get complicated. And one of the reasons why I end up in a place like Union Seminary is I can be freer. Mm-hmm. The legacies of Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr and James Cone and James Washington and James Forbes. Mm. You see, and you say, how could you be freer in a narrow Christian seminary? Well, because you're not obsessed with dogma or doctrine. You're obsessed with ways in which love, which is one and many at the same time, all the many manifestations of love, not just of neighbor, not just of even enemy. And as a Christian, I try to love my enemies, but I don't try that by myself. I need a lot of grace for that. But when you love in truth and beauty, you're going to need a broader synoptic vision of the world to connect truth and beauty and goodness, you see. And so our young brother, that's the kind of energy you want, brother. That's the kind of vitality and vibrancy you want. And don't let anybody dampen your fire, but that kind of those forms of love. And that's one of the reasons why, again, I leave Harvard with a smile. You see, very much so. This is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer chair. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the greatest Christian witness against the evil thug named Hitler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was fundamentally transformed when he went to Harlem under Adam Clayton Powell Sr. He said, first time I heard the gospel in my life was in Harlem. He got a PhD in theology already. These Black people taught him something, taught him much. The brother who gave every penny of his pension, Donald Shriver, for activating the Dietrich Bonhoeffer chair that I will be occupying at Union. He grew up in Jim Crow, North Carolina. Jim Crow, North Carolina. Preston Williams, towering figure here at Harvard Divinity School. When he first met Donald Shriver, he was talking about how great Robert E. Lee was. Look at the metamorphosis he underwent. Look at the change he underwent. What if somebody had given up on him? And he ends up bringing together James Cone, James Washington, James Forbes, hires me at 23 years old. And now at 67, I go back to occupy the chair that he, through blood, sweat, and tears, with he and his wife, Peggy, provide the opportunity for the coming together of a Jim Crow vanilla brother who was transformed by the Black church, and here an extension of the Black church, but embracing this vanilla brother, not for no kumbaya moment, but because we in space and time trying to make sense of the world and trying to be love warriors, and we meet. You see, those are the joys of life. That's deeper than the pleasures. That's what we want to convey to our Ethiopian brother, sister, brother in Roxbury, you see. That's what's waiting for you at the best of these institutions, but push back the worst of these institutions. Don't allow them to somehow define you in a narrow way. You got too much spillover inside of your heart in mind and soul and body. And you owe it to your mom and your daddy and your grandparents too, because they knew the love that they gave you was something that can never be contained by any structure of domination.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to leave it there. But gentlemen, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us at home. Please, you can get this remarkable book at harvard.com. And we are recording this conversation. So if you want to go to
my brother's book, that's what it looks like. Look at all of those African colors, all of those beautiful African colors.
Thank you, Cornel. Thank you very much, Cornel. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, dear. You were
Thank you, Sister Nell.
Thank you. Thank you
You
both.
were wonderful. What a pleasure. And
It's
thank you,
wonderful.
Cornel.
Thank you so much, my dear brothers. Love you, man.
I love you. I love you
forever,
more.
brother, forever.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cornel.
Thank you. Stay well. Take care.
All right.
Have a good evening.